Bueno, y después de esta esperanzadora y maravillosa experiencia de Silvana, quisiera, nuestra última expositora de hoy es un personaje que actúa en todo este proyecto y a la cual todas le tenemos terror, en el fondo, porque va a despertar todas nuestras culpas. Es la apoderada. Así que con gran gusto, y espero que sea benevolente, quisiera presentar a Miriam Rey, apoderada de la Escuela Los Llanos de la comuna de Machalí. A la seta.
Buenos días, primero que todo. Yo me traje un torpedo. Yo soy Miriam Rey, pertenezco a la Escuela de los Llanos de Machalí, una comuna cerca de Rancagua, ¿ya? Y como ya lo dijo bien mi presentadora, tengo que hablar yo de la colaborativa, pero desde nuestra perspectiva de apoderados, ¿ya? Y primero que todo yo quisiera decir que la colaborativa en este sentido nos ha ayudado a nosotros como apoderados a potenciar los aprendizajes y continuar la tarea que la educadora está haciendo desde el aula en la casa, ¿ya? Yo en ese sentido tengo que decir que estoy muy agradecida también, muy sorprendida gratamente en el sentido de que yo pocas veces he visto que las instituciones en general incluyan dentro de sus proyectos el trabajo del apoderado. Siempre trabajan con el alumno, con los jefes de UTP, el colegio, otros participantes de la educación, pero el apoderado nunca es considerado, siendo parte importante, muy importante del proceso educativo de los hijos. Porque los hijos son nuestra materia prima, nosotros les estamos dando una materia prima valiosa, lo más valioso que tenemos, y queremos que ustedes hagan lo mejor con ella, ¿ya? No porque seamos colegios municipales, tenemos que aspirar a una educación menor, al contrario, nosotros queremos un futuro mejor para nuestros hijos y para la sociedad. Y a partir de eso yo he visto aquí en este proyecto, en el proyecto Oportunidad, lo primero las sesiones de aprendizaje. Nosotros hemos tenido 2. En la primera yo recuerdo que como que no sabía bien de qué, el sentido de esto. Yo creo que las educadoras mías de mi curso tuvieron la misma impresión porque fue como la presentación del proyecto, pero en definitiva la implementación del proyecto no se veía clara. Sin embargo, en la segunda sesión ya quedó bastante claro cómo se iba a trabajar, en qué sentido se iba a potenciar el aprendizaje de los niños, cuáles eran las tareas que se estaban desarrollando y las herramientas, ¿ya? Y dentro de esas herramientas se vio el proceso de mejora continua, que nos quedó claro, por lo menos 2 apoderadas somos las que vamos a estas presentaciones. Es como el ensayo y error, así, contigo aprendo. ¿Ya? Y a mí me gustó mucho en el sentido de que se prueba en los niños algo que se cree que va a resultar. Nuestros hijos están ahí siendo conejillos de indias en definitiva, ¿ya? Se prueban técnicas con ellos, en el caso de mis educadoras, que apuntan a la escritura y a mejorar la lectura también, pero sobre todo la escritura porque era como el índice más bajo que tenían dentro de la evaluación que hicieron a principios de año. Entonces ese es el que la educadora de mi sala escogió. Y orientadas, por supuesto, por el programa, implementan estrategias que van evaluando continuamente. Y eso a mí me encantó, porque por lo general en la mayoría de los proyectos se ve que se implementa una estrategia y después de 4 años, 5 años se ve que no resultó y ahí cambiámosla. O sea, y no se considera a todos los actores. Sin embargo, en este caso también pudimos nosotros participar, ver qué está haciendo, y no con el afán de lapidar a la educadora, porque ser profesor es muy difícil. Trabajar con 20 niños distintos que vienen de condiciones distintas. Nuestro colegio es un colegio municipal abierto a toda matrícula que recibe niños vulnerables de todo tipo y que en muchos casos no hay un apoyo de la casa. Entonces, la labor es dura, es difícil. Sin embargo, las tías con harto amor lo han hecho y en esta experiencia en la otra parte donde fuimos, nos mostraron las experiencias con padres, tuvimos la instancia de ver qué estaban haciendo otros colegios, que ya les estaba resultando. Entonces eso podíamos nosotros implementarlo con nuestros niños. Y fue rico porque también se vio, las educadoras dieron la oportunidad, y yo creo que va dentro del proyecto también, de que nosotras como apoderadas opináramos qué es lo que nos parecía bien, qué nos parecía mal, qué creíamos nosotros que nos podía ayudar a potenciar el logro del objetivo que tiene el programa, que en definitiva es la mejora de la educación de nuestros hijos, ¿ya? Y eso la tía también lo ha potenciado en las reuniones de apoderados, donde pone una PowerPoint, explica la metodología que se está ocupando, nos enseña a los papás cómo trabajar desde la casa con las plantillas del abecedario, cómo ayudar al niño a que relacione las letras del abecedario con los sonidos. Y yo puedo decir, gracias a Dios, yo tengo educación, pero no todos los papás la tienen, ¿ya? Y muchos papitos que trabajan todo el día, mamás, llegan a su casa y en definitiva no saben cómo enfrentar la tarea con el niño y lo hacen como puede o como lo hizo la abuelita que está a cargo, o si se pudo se hace y si no se pudo, no. Sin embargo, en este caso, en las reuniones siempre se nos está destacando el cómo trabajar, cómo ayudarlo con la lectura, qué preguntas, cómo guiarlo. Entonces, estamos trabajando por un bien común. Y las tías, en virtud de eso, también recogieron nuestra sugerencia para su planificación, la que hicimos en el último encuentro. Que a nosotros nos gustó mucho la experiencia de otro colegio en que le mandaban por escrito al apoderado paso a paso qué era lo que se esperaba que hiciera en su tarea. Yo creo que eso es súper importante, porque uno como apoderado, uno como mamá, trabaja, es dueña de casa, hace un montón de cosas, ¿cierto? Tiene que llegar a la casa, sacarse el traje y ponerse el delantal y hacer miles de otras cosas más. Entonces, al final, el tiempo que queda para el niño a veces es tan poco, es tan mínimo, que la tarea se hace como resultó. Sin embargo, con esta guía decía claramente, bueno, el niño debe de leer este texto o debe contarle qué es lo que leyó. Usted tiene que hacerle esta pregunta, así, claramente. Preguntarle esto, escribir lo que el niño opinó, si se va a trabajar en vocabulario, que se mande la palabra nueva de la semana, cosa que uno dentro del lenguaje propio de los niños puede incorporarlo. Y eso es genial, porque estamos trabajando para potenciar lo que la educadora hace en la casa, o sea, en el colegio, y eso, fantástico, o sea, a mí me encanta. ¿Ya? Y otra cosa, también hubo el encuentro entre colegios, esto como pasantía, que fueron las tías con otra apoderada. Yo lamentablemente no pude ir, pero la apoderada compartió la experiencia que había pasado en reunión de apoderados que habían, y allá vieron el gira y escucha. Y me contaba la otra apoderada que en definitiva fue muy positivo para la autorregulación de los niños. Entonces eso se implementa en el aula con los niños y uno ve el resultado en la casa, porque por ejemplo mi chiquitita que tiene 4 años y todo, estamos a veces en el almuerzo y ella tímidamente levanta su mano y dice, cuando uno habla los demás se callan, dice. Entonces ahí uno ve que efectivamente es la parte de convivencia y cosas que uno como adulto en el training, que yo tengo 3 hijos, entre escucharlos a todos, conversar, comer y todo, descuida esas cosas. Sin embargo, ella nos enseña también. Así que yo estoy súper contenta con el proyecto, con la fundación, y como reflexión yo les quiero pedir, primero que todo agradecer y pedir que sigan en esto, porque así como las apoderadas les exigimos a las tías cuando vimos esto que nivelaran hacia arriba, porque ellas estaban considerando que del porcentaje 70% nomás, porque había niños que tenían problemas y todo, nosotros como apoderadas, las que estamos participando, le dijimos que no, que queríamos un 90%, porque a nuestros niños hay que sacarles el jugo. Ahora es el momento de exprimirlos, de ponerles metas altas, de ayudarlos a que no sean mediocres en esta vida y se conformen siempre con lo mínimo. Nosotros tenemos que poner expectativas altas para nuestros hijos y hacer que la educadora también lo ponga. Si en el camino quizás no resulta tanto como quisimos, no importa, pero el proceso que hubo de por medio para llegar a esa meta nos va a enriquecer a todos y nos va a hacer un gran país. Así que ese es mi aporte de apoderar.
Quiero, sin más, partir por una de las tarjetitas, que creo que nos interpreta todo. Solo agradecerle por contarnos su experiencia y entrega. Sin duda, verles es un momento tendrá que ser para reafirmar la vocación. Así que gracias. Muchas gracias. Tenemos un grave problema, como siempre en la vida, que hay que escoger. O el café o la pregunta. Y como siempre tratamos de buscar el justo medio. Así que he ordenado así, sin ninguna mayor pretensión, pero a ver si podemos entonces buscar respuestas más bien cortas y que podamos conversar en el café y así no nos perdemos ni una ni otra. ¿Ok? Entonces, a ver, hay una idea con la forma de trabajo, así que sigo en esta. En esas escuelas existieron condiciones básicas de implementación, necesitaron tener procesos normalizados antes de implementar. Segundo, porque voy a juntar ahí en eso. ¿Cómo se trabajan las estrategias de autorregulación direccionadas a la convivencia? Y sobre todo esta, que creo que tiene más que con la anterior, ¿implementar esta metodología requiere de mucho trabajo? ¿Cómo lo hacen para que les alcance el tiempo? Voy a dejar estas tres cortitas, después sigo con las otras.
Ya, ok.
¿Ya?
Yo creo que voy a partir por la última. Sí, se requiere un poco más de trabajo, pero yo creo que no es tanto, porque los profesores estamos acostumbrados y desde siempre a hacer muchas cosas. Somos psicólogos, sociales, somos enfermeras, etcétera. Hacemos muchas cosas en la escuela, pero yo creo que este programa nos ayudó a realizar un nuevo enfoque, a sistematizar, a ser más riguroso. Yo creo que y lo mejor es a tener datos, a cómo llevar los datos que nos va a permitir ir mejorando paulatinamente. No es más trabajo, si bien es cierto nosotros como escuela rural con cursos multigrado lo pudimos hacer, yo creo que es más factible todavía en una escuela donde hay cursos simples. La segunda pregunta era sobre la autorregulación.
Sí, sobre la autorregulación y después si existían las condiciones previas para poder implementarlo. Condiciones básicas de implementación.
Sí, por supuesto. Nosotros todas las escuelas ya teníamos nuestros proyectos institucionales y solamente les reformulamos o les orientamos un nuevo enfoque. Hacer con estas mismas actividades ser más rigurosos, tener metas claras, un norte que todos sabíamos para dónde íbamos, un trabajo en equipo. Y en la autorregulación lo fuimos aprendiendo en el aula de prebásica. Y ahí yo me saco el sombrero cuando yo iba a hacer las evaluaciones al aula o acompañamiento a la educadora, yo era la que más beneficio obtenía de ese acompañamiento como jefe de UTP. Yo salía más retroalimentada, porque ahí fui viendo en la experiencia cómo ella iba realizando esta actividad de autorregulación, como decía la apoderada. Tan simple como los niños aprendan a levantar la mano para opinar. Y eso lo fuimos instalando en toda la básica.
Quisiera juntar dos preguntas porque van en el mismo tema. No sé cuál de las dos quiere responder. Uno es por qué enfocar el trabajo VC para subir resultados del CIMSE y el otro, qué tipo de prueba de cambio se instaló en la UE, que no sé lo que es, perdón. Para subir puntaje CIMSE basándose en el proyecto VC.
Sí. Sí, como lo decía, al reorientar nuestra política institucional en todos los aspectos y llevarla a metodologías prácticas en las aulas, de generación en generación. Ya en primer año yo vi a los alumnos que llegaron muy bien preparados. los de la primera generación que tuvo Alicia. Y en el segundo año aún más. Y se fue potenciando y esas estrategias como las fui tomando inmediatamente al aula de básica, con actividades rigurosas, como le di el énfasis en la lectura domiciliaria, con el apoyo de los apoderados, a la lectura comprensiva, ampliar el vocabulario, etcétera, mejoramos ostensiblemente el puntaje de CIMSE. Yo creo que este cuento es como ser sistemático, riguroso y ordenados. Esa es la clave del programa, a mi punto de vista. Ese es como el gran secreto.
Ya.
No sé
Perdona, estoy aquí pidiendo asesoría.
¿Me permites?
Sí,
don Pedro, le hicieron una pregunta al inicio y me quedé así como diciendo, habían algunos directivos que decían cómo estaban desmotivados, cómo podíamos motivarlos. Yo creo que con esto, con hechos palpables, con esto que ya hemos probado nosotros, escuelas pequeñas o con multigrado que dificulta aún más el llevar la educación en el aula. Yo creo que esto, ¿cómo nos va a generar en ellos la motivación para llevar a cabo estas prácticas exitosas? Con ejemplos palpables.
Muchas gracias, señora Laura. Le pregunté a Rosana, perdón, las preguntas no están dirigidas, ¿eh? Por eso estamos haciéndolo entre nosotros. Uno, ¿por qué se refieren a acelerar los aprendizajes? ¿Cómo involucran al Programa Nacional de Fomento Lector a las estrategias de lenguaje VC? Te junto esto con, ¿cuáles dirían ustedes que son los 3 aspectos más importantes para el éxito de la implementación VC? ¿Y esa también te la junto? Esto es una reflexión que yo creo que sí da para un largo café, diría. Algunos niñólogos nos preocupa que kinder y prekinder se transformen en espacios excesivamente estructurados, donde haya poco espacio para el juego, la creatividad y otros aspectos esenciales de la niñez. ¿Cómo ven ustedes este tema en sus escuelas? ¿Cómo ayuda o no VC en esto?
Bueno, respondiendo a la última pregunta. Respondiendo a la última pregunta acerca de esta reflexión de que los espacios de prebásica se transformen en espacios excesivamente estructurados, me gustaría decirles que nosotros tenemos altas expectativas de nuestros niños. Nuestros niños son muy capaces. La prebásica no es solamente para ir a jugar, ir a pintar, ir a recortar. Nuestros niños de prebásica tienen muchas habilidades. Y yo creo que con esta renovación profesional que hemos tenido, somos capaces de poder cruzar, de poder desarrollarles la expresión artística a la par con habilidades verbales, con habilidades lingüísticas, entregarles contenido y desarrollar su beta de dramatización, sus habilidades artísticas, etcétera. Yo siento que esto depende de nosotros como educadores. El no aburrir a los niños, el no transformar nuestra sala de prebásica en una sala de primero básico. Yo creo que depende de uno como educador. Así que no se asusten. Acá hay otra pregunta que dice, ¿cómo involucrar al plan de fomento lector con las estrategias de lenguaje VC? Está, como dice nuestra coordinadora Rosita Ureta, crucen chiquillas. Esto no es nada separado. El PAC, el plan de fomento lector, el VC, va todo de la mano. Entonces, conociendo la teoría, manejando bien las estrategias, manejando bien los planes, somos capaces de cruzar todo y lograr los aprendizajes en conjunto. No teniendo solo este bloque para trabajar VC, el otro bloque para trabajar plan de fomento lector, no es así. Se da todo junto y somos nosotros los que tenemos que ser capaces de organizar y de cruzar todo.
Muy bien. Bueno, creo que... Sí, claro, por favor.
Yo quiero acotar algo con respecto a lo que dice ahí de los juegos. Nosotros tuvimos una sesión con la familia en que se trabajó con los niños en distintas estaciones en que ellos eran juegos. Y a esta edad es como imposible sacar el juego de la cabeza del niño porque ellos a través del juego aprenden. Entonces, como ella dice, esta es la educadora y yo lo he visto en el aula con mi hija. Y uno también tiene que aplicarlo en la casa. Si uno pretende dictarle al niño o que haga palotes como hacíamos nosotros cuando éramos chicos, es bastante más difícil que si uno a través del juego, que haga un dibujo, ponerle un desafío, darle un premio o tantas otras cosas que las tías están aplicando en el aula, se logran igual los aprendizajes. Así que, no sé, pues parte de la vida de ellos. Eso.
Bueno, realmente creo que los representa a todos, agradeciéndole a María Laura, a Silvana y a Miriam esta maravillosa exposición. Creo que ha sido esta parte de la mañana increíble. Yo que no soy especialista en el tema de la profunda congruencia, esperanzadora además, entre la exposición de Pedro y la de ustedes tres, que realmente hacen sentido verdadero. Tanto que yo sospeché, Pedro, que tú las podrías haber plagiado, ¿eh? Yo creo que lo pescaste de ahí. Así que, si decía antes, estas son buenas noticias, realmente tenemos unas grandes noticias. Gracias enorme por todo lo que han hecho, gracias por estar aquí y quiero darles un recuerdo de nuestra fundación.
Con esta ronda de preguntas damos cierre al primer bloque del seminario y los invitamos a disfrutar de un rico café. Nos encontramos en 10 minutos más para retomar las exposiciones.
Alicia Grunow, no sé si lo estoy pronunciando bien, Alicia, ¿sí? Ella es de Carnegie Foundation, es socia senior de Carnegie Foundation, bueno, que es una institución tan famosa como el país, yo creo, a esta altura. Un centro de investigación que tiene, en fin, más de 100 años y destaca precisamente por su promoción del trabajo en red para mejorar la calidad de la enseñanza y del aprendizaje. Así que ella nos va a hablar de convertir ideas en acciones, trabajo en red para el mejoramiento de la calidad de la educación. Alicia, por favor. We are willing to hear you.
Muchísimas gracias. Bueno, le voy a mandar mis saludos en español, pero entonces voy a cambiar a inglés para que me puedan entender bien, ¿no? Entonces, como dijo, yo vengo de la Carnegie Foundation, que es una fundación que está ubicada ahí en Palo Alto, California, un poquito al sur de San Francisco. Y nosotros, básicamente, hemos estado en un camino casi paralelo a esa Fundación Educacional Oportunidad, ahí sin saberlo. Y entonces, aquí yo voy a hablar un poquito hoy de por qué nosotros, esta fundación, ha decidido de dedicar sus recursos a transferir esta metodología de mejoramiento al sector de educación. Y también le voy a compartir un poquito de lo que hemos hecho nosotros. Y aunque va a ver que hay varias diferencias entre los contextos en que estamos trabajando, yo creo que hay más semejanzas al fin del día que no. Entonces ahora, lo voy a cambiarlo en inglés. Empezamos así. Sí, por favor. Yo no puedo quedar en el mismo lugar por todo eso. Bueno. No problem. So, perfecto. So the Carnegie Foundation, this is a picture of the Carnegie Foundation. There's about 60 of us that work there. And it's a very old foundation in the United States and very well-respected foundation. But at the same time, they choose a new president every 10 to 15 years. And that president has the right to choose a new direction for the foundation. So right now we are working with, our president's name is Tony Bright. He's a very well-respected researcher in the United States. And he's also played a big role in educational reform, particularly in the city of Chicago. So the mission statement of the Carnegie Foundation ¿Cómo manejo esta cosa? Sí, sí, sí.
No, pero que aunque sea
Con mucho
inglés,
gusto.
aunque tenga...
Para avanzar.
Pero yo quiero... Pero no cambia.
El público tiene... Esto está en inglés y el público está en español.
Perfecto. Entonces, ¿cuál voy? Perfecto, entiendo. It's written in English here and Spanish there, and it changes differently, so it's a little bit confusing. So I'm going to try to speak slower. I was told that I should speak slower. Actually, even when I speak in English, to all English speakers, everybody always tells me I speak too fast. So I will try to speak slower, but if you have to remind me to speak slower throughout, don't worry about it. So the mission statement, which now left the screen, of the Carnegie Foundation is really centered on two really big ideas. One is the power of networks. So the idea of making networks of practitioners together with researchers, together with educational designers, people who make curriculum or products, and putting them together in a network so that they can work together on problems. And that is based on a really strong belief that we have at Carnegie that we can do much more together than any of us could possibly do alone. The second piece that we put together with the networks is this idea of improvement science, which we've heard a lot about in the beginning of the morning. And so putting these two ideas together, for us, is really the way that's really important and actually accelerate our ability to improve in the sector of education. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why Carnegie has decided to dedicate itself to these two things by taking you through a little history of my journey through the educational system as a professional, and pointing out a little bit about how the different sectors, in the United States at least, have organized educational change, and what that has done, and what it has sort of left missing in terms of really getting to the places that we want to get in terms of education. So I began my career in education as a teacher. So I was a teacher for 7 years. I always, throughout those 7 years, taught a group of students, I think you would call them a group that's niños vulnerables, así? And they're called English language learners. So these are students, and we have a lot of them in the United States, that come from families that at home speak a language other than English. And then they come into the educational system, and as a teacher, your job is that they learn math and reading and writing and social studies and science at the same time that they're learning English. So just from the start, it's a big challenge. It's a lot to learn at the same time. Especially for those of you who have tried to learn something in your second language, right? It's a big mental cognitive challenge. And then also, this is a group of students who come to the schools in the United States with many less resources. So they tend to come from families, wonderful families, that have oftentimes live in poverty or have less experiences with formal educational systems, that come with, whose parents work more in the home and those sorts of things. So it's a group of students and in the United States, it's a group of students that we have typically not served well. So they don't typically do well in our educational system. So I started teaching here in the middle of the country in Colorado, in a city called Denver, in the Denver Public Schools. This is Raul Huerta, one of my students. I started teaching in first grade, my first year, right out of the university. I taught in first grade, and Raul was in my class. And I remember, how many of you teach first grade? Sería primera básica? Sí? Yeah? Do we have any other first grade teachers in the room? Well, first graders are amazing, right? So first graders are an awesome, enthusiastic group of kids when they get to school, right? I remember always they would say, do we have homework today? Tía. No me llamaron tía porque ustedes usan tía. Pero do we have a homework today? And if you said no, they would cry, right? They were so excited. They wanted homework. They were always raising their hands. And I remember learning very early on as a teacher that statistically speaking in Denver, about a third of those students would graduate from high school on time, right? So I had 21 students in my class, and they would cry if they didn't have homework. And something happened in the next 12 years so that they didn't actually finish high school. What could that possibly be? So I taught in Denver for a couple of years, and then I went and I taught in New York, which is a completely different school system. I taught Dominicanos en vez de Mexicanos, right? So we had habichuelas en vez de frijoles, right? So you had a different Spanish that you had to learn and that they came to school with. But you had a very similar level of success with these students. In 2007, I think the figure was about 26% of these students that entered the school, excited in first grade, made it through and graduated in high school. Two different systems, very far away from each other, similar group of students, results that are just not okay, right, in a system of education, especially for a country who likes to say that we're the place that you can come and you can realize all of your dreams. So when I changed over to the New York City Public Schools, we also name our schools in New York with numbers. So I taught in a school that was named PS 48. It was a very different system to work in. So in the United States, what you have to know is that a lot of the governance and the finance of the school systems is local. So the decisions and the money and all of the governance in New York was very, very different, actually, than the governance that was in Denver. And you would notice it a little bit when you went to the different schools. So the first thing I noticed as a teacher, moving from Denver Public Schools over to the New York City Public Schools, was they paid me more. Because I worked with a group of vulnerable students. And in New York, they had an incentive program to try to bring better teachers to work with those students. So there was incentives, and I got a little extra money every year in order to teach in these schools. The other thing that you would notice is that they spend a lot more money in New York City on education than they do in Denver. So I think the figure is something around $13,000 per student in New York, and it was $8,000 per student in Denver. So lots more money. And you could see that there was more money. I had a lot more books. I had these closets, and you'd open them, and they'd be full of curriculum. Right? I had libraries in English and libraries in Spanish. We also had a lot more support staff. So we had a full-time psychologist. We had a full-time social worker. We had about 6 coaches. We had a lot more people that were there to help you and work in the school. We also, while I was there, changed the curriculum that we were using. We rolled in a whole new math curriculum. We as teachers went and we sat for 3 or 4 days, right, in a professional development program while they told us what we were going to do. And we had that new math program roll out throughout that year. We changed to the latest and best way of teaching English language learners from research, which was a program that was called dual language. It was a different way of teaching English language learners. And there was a much stronger accountability system at that time. So we knew how well the English language learners were doing in that school, and the government had put a new goal that in 4 years, that number was going to get higher. So we had all of these things in place. And I think one of the things that is most interesting about it is to be a teacher there. It didn't really add up to very much that was different in terms of what you did every day. I definitely didn't feel more supported. We had, in fact, I was thinking about it earlier when I was listening to the panel, we had a parent coordinator, a person whose entire job, full-time, in the school was to coordinate parents. But the parents weren't really any more involved, and if anything, maybe they were less involved than they had been in Denver. And it also didn't add up to much more of a quality education from the students' point of view. The experiences that they had from first grade to second grade to third grade, they weren't very integrated. So why could that be? Why is that? And it should trouble us slightly, at least in the United States, because these things, incentives, more money, more resources, more staff, the latest program, the best research, are some of our favorite ways to try to change education. And we spend a ton of money and time and energy on all of these ways, but it didn't make any difference into what happened into my classroom. One small reflection is you notice what's missing in this entire picture, which was here about half an hour ago. We weren't very included. Things arrived to us. We were told what goals to meet, and we got more stuff. But there wasn't a big inclusion of the teachers in this whole process of going about change. And so why is this? Why is it that this doesn't result into changes in the classroom? Well, let's take a small, famous thought experiment. So think about this for a moment. What would happen? What would you have if you built a car out of the very best car parts that exist in the world? So you get to take the brakes from a Porsche, which evidently are the best brakes. I'm not a big car person, but I've been told that the brakes in the Porsche are the way to go. You would take the engine from the Ferrari, because the engine of the Ferrari is much better than it is of the Porsche. You could put it together in the Volvo body, which is very safe and solid. And then you'd add the chassis of the BMW. You have the best parts in the world. Put it together in a car. What do you suppose you'll have? A very expensive pile of junk, is what we would say in English. And in some ways, this is how we've gone about reforming education, at least in the United States. I don't know if it's the same in Chile, but we've invested in a lot of really expensive parts. But what hasn't happened is these parts haven't come together to form a system that makes sense from the point of view of the teachers, and a system that makes sense from the point of view of the students that are going through the system. So one of the things, this is a theme that we've heard over and over again in each of the sessions. And I think it's because in improvement, when we take the methodologies of improvement, improving the system is where all of the focus goes. And that's a different focus. In fact, it's a different mindset, and in some ways it's a different belief about what is going to make a difference. So two of my favorite quotes that come about being system. The first is that 94% of the performance of an organization is attributable to the system. 94%. I think a lot of times we think that 94% of the results are due to individuals. And that's a very different proposition than saying that it's due to the system. And it changes how you'd go about solving them. I even would say that when I was first a teacher, I thought, like a good American kid, that I could go in and be the superstar that really made a huge difference. And I wanted to be very much. That's why I went into teaching. But you're only working in that 6%, right, of what we can do as superstars. If we really want to see all of the results we want, we got to work at that 94%. That's the rest of the system. The other quote is one that Pedro already shared with us, is that every system is designed to achieve exactly the results that it gets. And so when we start working on a problem, what we first have to be able to see is the system that is producing those results. New York City had a system that produced 26% of its English language learners graduating from high school. It's a system. It wasn't the educators who weren't trying or didn't care. It wasn't the families. They have a system that produces that result. So if they want a different result, then New York City has to start looking at the system and start working to improve the system. I think that's one of the ways that the methodologies of continuous improvement are super exciting, because it gives us a way of doing that. I ended up leaving teaching after about 7 years and went into educational research. And when I think back to why did I ever leave teaching, because I loved teaching, I think that I got to a point where you didn't learn anything as a teacher. I think if I had been on this panel, or if I had been part of Un Buen Comienzo when I was a teacher, I probably never would have left teaching. But you didn't learn as a teacher. You helped the students learn, and you weren't really involved in anything about making something better. And so I went to where people learn. Where do people learn? Well, they learn in universities, right? So I went to Stanford University, actually, and got a doctorate in education and also studied economics. And it was very interesting to me what kinds of questions were asked in educational research. So one of the questions you might hear in an educational research program is this question that's focused on, does bilingual education work? Right? So there's a variety of different ways that we could educate English language learners, and we want to know what works. And research is actually excellent for helping us figure this out so that we are working on the best ideas. Does bilingual education work? The thing is, in general, people would say, yeah, it works. There's a big debate about it, but in general, people will say, yeah, it works. And for those of you who've worked in schools, you will know that it is probably true that everything works somewhere. The difficult part is getting something to work everywhere. And that is a really difficult question. And so the beauty of educational research is it has a variety of very rigorous methodologies for answering these questions of what works. But knowing what works actually isn't enough for us to get it to work in the schools reliably across lots of different contexts all of the time. And that needs a different methodology, just as rigorous, but focused on a different question. And that's the question of how. How do you get bilingual education to work reliably at scale? When they came with dual language, this new program in New York City, and they said, this works, here, go do it. That wasn't actually the information I needed as a teacher to make it work. I needed to know, how do you make it work? And for that, you gotta get into the practices, the everyday practices and processes that are happening inside of classrooms, which is the second beautiful thing that the improvement methodologies will do for you. So, where are we in the United States? We got a lot of good ideas about how to improve education, lots of them. We spend quite a bit of money. We have teachers that I would say are hardworking and giving their best efforts every single day. I don't think we have any problems on that level. And a lot of passion and care about students. But we have very slow progress on difficult educational problems. We have progress. We learn the education of today is better than the education of yesterday. But what we're asking of our educational system is going to grow and to grow and to grow. And the way that we learn is not enough to keep up with where we need it to be. And so what we really need is a better way to learn together, to figure out how to solve a lot of these educational problems in order to improve. And so that would be the missing piece: research, practice, and now we have improvement. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a project. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that you could call a collaborative. So it's fairly similar to the idea of un buen comienzo. It actually works with a group of students that are on the other end of the spectrum. So we're working with students that are in the university. Now, to understand this project, I'm going to give you a little bit of context in the United States. We have some institutions in the United States that are called community colleges. They're properly colleges, and about 45% of the students that go to college or the university in the United States go to community colleges. Lots of students, almost half. In these institutions, so in some ways, the institutions are a result of a desire in the country to increase access to higher education in the United States. And we've done that. We've increased access. Many, many more students have access to higher education than they ever did before. The problem is, while they have access, they have very low results of graduation in the community colleges. So in the community college, you can go two different ways. You can get a technical degree. You can become a nurse or a firefighter or a police officer. It's a 2-year degree. You get a title, and you could stop there, and you have a profession for the rest of your life. You could also, go for 2 years to the community college and then transfer to the university. So there's two different ways that you could go into the community college. And one of the things that you have to do, no matter what, no matter which direction you're going, is you have to pass a mathematics class, a college-level mathematics class. And in the community colleges, there's an extraordinarily high failure rate of students in these math classes. And disproportionately, the problem comes from students who come from impoverished backgrounds, Latinos, African Americans, are students that are the most vulnerable in the United States. So what we did is we formed a network of community colleges across the United States, focused on increasing the number of students that actually make it through their mathematics credit within 1 year of enrolling in the college. There's been about 20 years of reform. We've known that this is a problem for a very long time. We know that mathematics is the barrier for a huge amount of students in community colleges, and yet it hasn't moved. It's been a problem for a long time. We've spent money, and there has been very little reform. So we wanted to work on it in a new way. We brought together 44 different community colleges across the country. So geographically, they're very dispersed. We have some that are all the way over in California, in every corner, actually. So in California, and Florida, and New York, and Washington. And we have groups at each community college of 5 people, right? Very similar to the idea of un buen comienzo. We also, in the network, have researchers that have deep expertise in the different areas that we're working on. And we also have people that are capable of designing the kind of online learning that we need, or curriculum objects that we need in order to make progress. So that's the network. Carnegie sits at the middle of the network, trying to integrate everything that everybody's learned and spread it out to the other parts of the network. Here's how it typically looks in the university. So normally, if you're going to go to a community college, it's what we call an open door institution, which means it accepts any student who wants to go to college in that institution. You take a test the first day that you're there, and that tells you how many classes of math you have to take before you get to the college level math class. So the blue classes up here don't count for any sort of college class. The remedial classes, things that you should have learned in high school that you have to take over and over again. So when you go into community colleges, 60 to 70% of the students that go to community college have to take classes again. Some of them have to take 3 classes, some of them have to take 2 classes, before they can even get to a class that counts as their college level math class. If we fast forward 2 years, about less than 15% of the students have successfully completed this math course. So this means that they can't be a nurse, they can't be a doctor, and it has huge repercussions for students in their lives. They can make tens of thousands of dollars more, even with a 2-year degree from a community college, than if they don't have one. This means the difference between able to support their families and no. So what we did, what Uri Treisman calls this, is that remedial mathematics in community college is literally where aspirations go to die. You have an aspiration of a career, of somewhere you want to go, of a family that you want to have, of a way you want to support your life. Go to remedial mathematics, and there it will die. So what we did is we took a systems approach to trying to solve this problem. And we had spent a lot of time looking at the system that was producing that 15% getting through in 2 years. Do you know where you lose a lot of the students in that first pathway up top there? In some ways, it's easy to guess. In between the classes, right? So you get into a class, maybe you pass it, maybe you don't, and then we lose them in between the classes. So we designed a system that didn't have so many places where the student could get lost, putting it together into one pathway. In the traditional system, if you want advising support, you have to go to a different place in the university to get it, which makes sense to us in organizing organizations, right? The advising people are over here, the math people are over here. But from the point of view of the student that's going through the system, this is not a system. This is not a system that's designed for the needs of the student. So we took the advising and we rolled it into the pathway as well. so that it would make sense from the point of view of the student. We also had to do quite a bit of changing in how teachers taught mathematics. And that became another really important part of the system that needed to change. And we needed to figure out ways to support teachers to learn how to teach mathematics in a different way. So we worked on this, and in our first year, after 1 year, 50% of the students finished the math credit. So from less than 15% in 2 years to 50% in 1 year. In some ways, we like to say that it tripled the success rate in half of the time, which has a big significance in terms of the income earnings of the students and where they can arrive in their careers. So what are we going to do now? We got to 50%. And if we were somewhat of a typical evaluation, we'd say, well, it works. The pathway works, we're done. 50% is much more than 15%, right? But 50% was never our north. 50%, our north was much higher. And so now we go and we continue on this process of continual improvement. We spent a lot of time looking at data, trying to figure out where could we work that would really make a difference? Which students is it that aren't succeeding? How could we support them better? Then we formed sub-networks around really important problems that we didn't know how to solve. Once those networks learn something, very concrete practices, those practices get spread to the rest of the people in the network. You end up with a better system, and then you go analyzing data until improving una y otra vez. So I wanted to tell you about one of the areas. This year we have 4 different areas that we're working on in order to really push that level of 50 even higher. And one of them that we're working on is something called social belonging. This is actually a beautiful example of a really productive partnership between research and practice, because this idea of social belonging came from the social psychologists. They said this is really important that students, particularly at this age, feel as if they belong and they should be in the class. So we asked students on day 1 of the class, day 1 when they enter in the first semester, how often, if ever, do you wonder, maybe I don't belong here? Day 1, we ask them one question, doesn't take very long. And then we can look at the end of the semester to which of the students are actually still in the class. Because in community colleges, you have, in the university in general, you have the problems of dropouts. People who they go a couple of weeks and then they disappear. And on that first day, by the answer to that question, if you say never, I never feel like I don't belong here, about 12% drop out. Still some, but not very many. And if you say always, 40% drop out. And you could see maybe why this happens from sort of a psychological point of view. So if I believe in this math class, well, somebody like me, a woman maybe, doesn't really belong in this math class, and I get a test back, and it says I didn't do very well, I'm not going to think, wow, I should work harder. I'm not going to think, oh, maybe it was because I didn't quite study right, or I need a study partner. I'm going to think, well, that just shows me that I was right. I really don't belong here. And you give up, right, on the very sort of social psychological side of things. Well, the fact that we know that this is true, that we know that there's a segment of students on day 1 and we know that they're likely to drop out, well, now we can do something about that, and we can intervene. And we can figure out what is it, what could we do to help students believe that they really belong in that class. Well, something that's very interesting about this finding is if you take a look at it by ethnicity. So now we'll look at African American students. African American students have definitely the lowest level of success in the course. You'll see that for African American students, the effect is huge, much bigger than the average. So 71% of these students, if they're African American, and they say, I always believe I don't belong here, will end up dropping out of that course. Only 29% of them will still be there. Now, this is a really interesting example of measurement that can help us to learn. We in the United States for a very long time have measured the gap between African American students and other students, white students, Latinos, Asian students. And that's important for us as a country to measure because that's something that we would like to have closed. But it's not something that you can do something about, or at least it's not obvious how to do something about it. Now, social belonging is something that the social psychologists tell us is something you can do about. And as we do it, we can go changing the gap that we're actually trying to attack. So this is that idea of going to the processes in order to get to the results that we want to. So what are we currently doing? Something that should sound fairly familiar based on the morning. We have a network of professors, of faculty members in the community college that are trying to solve the problem. I think currently in this network there's about 24 professors who have decided that they want to work on this. And we've also put a social psychologist that works with us from the University of Texas into the same network to try to generate ideas. And what they're doing is they're using PDSA cycles to try to invent practices in their classroom that can change this. So they have datos. They have, just like actually, interestingly, the young students in Un Buen Comienzo, attendance is a huge predictor. So they measure attendance on a very daily basis. They have other ways of measuring whether the students are beginning to feel like they belong in the course. And they're trying new things. Well, what if I did this? Would that result in a change? There's been two recently ideas that different professors out in the network have developed. One was an attendance routine. This was a way for when there was a student missing in the class that their compañeros called them or texted them and gave them the material that they were missing from the class. Turned out that this changed her attendance dramatically in the classroom. Another one was the way that the classroom was organized in groups that were really functional, so that the student really felt part of a group that was responsible for learning in the classroom. It made a huge difference in the students' beliefs that they belonged and that they could do mathematics. Now, these were things that the researchers couldn't have told us to do, because the expertise lie in the people that were in the classroom every day who knew those students and who could figure out how is it that we can go about developing practices that can actually change these outcomes that we care about. Well, now that they've been developed in one classroom, and they can be shared across other classrooms, and other faculty and professors have picked them up and tried using them in their classroom, tried to learn what it would take to make that sort of thing work in their particular problem. And in a lot of ways, this is really what ends up accelerating learning. Because while these faculty are working on social belonging, another group of faculty are working on something else, and another group of faculty are working on a third thing, yet they can all share what they're learning and go improving at a much faster rate. So, where are we? With the same promising ideas, in some ways with the same money, with the same hard work and hard effort, with the same passion, but I loved how it was said earlier, a systematic and rigorous way of working that really harnesses all of those resources that we already have in our educational system and makes them so that we are more likely to actually have the outcomes that we're looking for at scale. And it's really a lot, I think, about learning. I've always found it ironic that we are, as educators, we are the learning organization. We teach children how to learn. We know about learning. We study learning all of the time. But as organizations, we're fairly slow to learn together and from one another, slow to do some of the things that we have our students doing on a very regular basis. The Carnegie Foundation is now turning a bit of a corner. So we've spent the last 5 years running 2 different networks, this one that I talked to you about, and another one. And now there has started to generate a lot of interest in the United States in working in this way, or at least some interest. And I thought it would be interesting to share a bit what we have learned with why it is difficult and why is it important to work in this particular different way. And I actually think that a lot of these themes have already been said by some of the people that have come before. The first one is that I think there's an immense power in starting with a problem of practice. And that is to say, with a problem that occurs inside schools, inside classrooms, and joining all of the expertise around that particular problem of practice as that being the thing that we actually want to work towards. A second thing that has been really interesting in talking to different people who say, yes, we would love to work in a network improvement community as well, is how much you have to commit to doing in common in order to really facilitate how easy it is to learn from one another, right? A common north, a common methodology, a common analysis of what are the 4 or 5 things that we're going to work on, common measurement. A lot of times we'll have groups that will come to us and they will say, yes, we want to do a network improvement community, until you tell them how much they have to commit to in common, a common north, right? And so the courage to really do that, to commit to that commonness, is really what allows you to learn very easily from one another. And the last one is the big difference in culture that this takes. It's a big difference to talk about thinking of us as having superstars that are going to get to our outcomes, right? As opposed to groups of people that are going to figure out together how to work together. It's very hard to admit that you fail at things. But failing, like falling down on a bike, is part of learning. And until we're more comfortable with having failures and doing them on a small scale, it's going to be very hard for us to make progress. And I think part of the hardest part has been for us is that people want immediate, quick change. They want what we would call in the United States the silver bullet, the one program that I can design and implement tomorrow that will make all of these differences. And this idea of starting very small, with practices that feel very small, that are happening in one classroom, and starting there, it's hard to have that patience, or in some ways that faith, that by starting small, what you're really able to do is accelerate how you're able to learn. I think I would close by saying this middle comment about what you have to have in common. One of the things I think I've had the opportunity also with Pedro to spend some time visiting the schools of Un Buen Comienzo, and it was an inspiration in so many ways for the work that we have back in the United States. And listening to the panel talk today, that in some ways we have a common north between all of us, and we have a common methodology, and in fact, even though we do it in English and you do it in Spanish, we have a common language for talking about this improvement community. And so if I were to answer the question about where do I want the conversation to be next year, I would love us to have a big international community that's focused on bringing this kind of work and this kind of change to our professions and to our educational sector. Because I think that will accelerate our ability to each individually on a meta level to do what we're trying to do in each of the projects. Thanks.
Una gran presentación, sin duda, que sin duda contribuye a construir este lenguaje común. Así que quizás si nos hicieran la pregunta, ¿do you belong here? Podríamos tener always. O sea, no, never. Era al revés. Te voy a leer así las preguntas. ¿Tú entiendes? Bueno, además hay traducción, pero... Do you want them?
Yo voy a contestar que yo escucho, y si no contesto bien me avisa, entonces.
Perfecto.
Pero uno por uno, por favor.
Yes, okay. ¿Qué competencias sugieren que los estudiantes de pedagogía aprendan para generar y participar en sistemas de mejora en sus escuelas? It's difficult to a ver, no está fácil de formular. ¿Qué competencias sugieren que los estudiantes de pedagogía aprendan para generar y participar en sistemas de mejora en sus estudios? No sé si entiendo cuáles los estudiantes proponen. ¿Ustedes entenderían eso o no? ¿Cuáles ellos proponen? Explícale porque yo no...
Sí, yo creo que, bueno, lo voy a explicar en inglés. But I think a lot of them we saw earlier today, right? So there is definitely a certain amount of comfort dealing with data that can sometimes, in the same way that mathematics can be scary for a whole host of individuals, data can oftentimes be very difficult to deal with, and knowing how to interpret that in order to interpret what the data really is telling us, I think is something that's very important. This notion of what the teachers are doing continuously is they're putting forth they're making explicit their theories, and then they're figuring out a way to test that theory in the classroom, which is a lot like the scientific method, right? But a lot harder than it sounds. To actually say, I think I'm going to do this, and I think this is going to happen, and now I'm going to go evaluate whether that was true in my classroom. That's the motor of learning that happens in improvement, and it's a kind of thinking that's difficult to learn at first. I think one of the things that's related to this that we've thought about in the United States, so we're a foundation that's dedicated to getting improvement methodologies to happen across the United States. That's what we would love to do. That's our north. And I do believe that unless we change a bit the professional education of teachers, how they're prepared, it's going to be very difficult. Or to say the flip side, how teachers are prepared is an incredible lever, an incredible place for teachers to learn to do this sort of work that can serve them throughout their entire career. So it is one area that we've actually started talking to some teacher preparation programs. We have a dream of having a network of teacher education programs. And also of educational leaders, because you heard earlier that the ability to do this really depends on the principals and the administrators of the school, so that they can learn this methodology as they're being prepared and bring it into the school system. So when we think about scale, we think that those are two very important levers.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta está muy larga, así que vamos a tener que hacer short. Si el 91% del desempeño es el sistema, ¿cómo mejorar el sistema educativo, en Chile, dice, que por esencia promueve segregación social?
Sí.
Do you get that? Sí.
Yo creo. We use the word system in two different ways. So here in the question, the system is being used to think of the entire system of education. So the way, which is important. I think in order to really do the continuous improvement work, you have to pick off a small but very, very strategic and important part of the system and make progress. So Un Buen Comienzo has done this. They have said, gosh, if we could get this 3 to 5 years right, maybe by the time they get to community colleges, they'll have much more success, right? So they've taken a strategic part of the system, the part that starts at right there, and tried to fix that piece of it. We, on the other end, had started working with the community colleges, which is another piece of the system. But I think the important part is picking off something that's really important, that's a big barrier, that could change the lives. If you solved it, it could change the lives of millions of students, and start there.
Fine. ¿Cuáles son, está un poco, si consideras que ya está respondido a las otras preguntas, tú me dices, ¿cuáles son los principales temas que se eligen para intervenir usando esta metodología?
¿Qué son las primeras cosas que...?
Los principales temas que se eligen para intervenir usando esta metodología.
¿Cómo de metodología?
O sea, sí. Which are the main topics you choose to make the intervention? O sea, why do you intervene finally? I hope.
Bueno, I think that you're asking about the methodology, how we start by teaching the methodology. Does that sound right? Yeah? We always start with we choose the bigger topics. I understand. So we're always looking for in improvement, there you need 3 things. You need will of people, you need ideas, and you need the ability to execute. So we're always looking for problems that are A, very important, that affect the lives of lots and lots of millions of students, and B, that we believe that we can build the will, have the ideas, and the capacity to execute on them.
Fine. This should be a short question. If there are other countries that are working in this experience. Que, de esta manera de contribuir para aumentar oportunidades de los alumnos. ¿Hay otros países?
Well, it's been very interesting. We didn't know that Chile was working on it until relatively recently, which was really exciting because we actually work with IHI and they worked with IHI and we didn't know that each other existed. So we were so excited that we had a friend in the world somewhere else here in Chile. I think there is some thought in New Zealand, speaking just of the education sector, I know there is some initial work with the entire country, actually, of New Zealand that they're thinking about doing improvement. In the United States, which I think is very interesting, we work with a lot of people who work across sectors, who work in manufacturing, health, different areas, and who have long careers, 20, 30 years working in improvement, and they have said that education in the United States has been the one sector that they haven't been able to get improvement into. So it's not that it hasn't been tried before, but it's a very stubborn sector, at least in the United States, to actually get these methodologies to happen in. So I think we're going to need internationally lots of different examples for us to actually learn how to do it.
What specific practice is allowed to improve from 15% minus, I think, 15% to 50% in the math tests? Is this improvement sustainable in the long term?
So we're in the second year of the project, and it's been sustained so far. So it's sustained in both places. I would say the biggest piece was putting it into an integrated pathway. I'd say a second really important piece is we changed how math was taught. So it used to be taught, I'm the professor, I lecture, you learn. And now it's taught in a way that's much more collaborative, which is based on the latest research. And I do think thinking about the social psychological barriers that are occurring in classrooms and actually taking them on and doing interventions with them straight up front has made a huge difference.
Fine. And the last question has to do with Hispanic families. Usted que trabajó con estudiantes y familias hispanas que en general tienen una cultura más colectiva, ¿qué desafíos específicos ve para el trabajo con familias de niños latinos en las escuelas? Tuyo.
Sí,
it says.
My one doubt about answering the question is I think it's going to be different in the United States than it would be in Chile. I think that in general, in the schools in the United States, a lot of the times we have, there's a general belief, or maybe it's a fear or a non-knowledge that the parents don't care and that's why they're not at the school, as opposed to really seeing how is it that we could actually create something that makes sense for the parents to come in and work with the school. I think part of that is the cultural differences that occur between those students and the students and other students in the different areas. As a slight aside, we were talking yesterday about is it going to be different to get improvement methodologies to happen in a Latino country than it is in the United States? I don't know if this is true, and I don't know enough about the Chilean culture to say this, but the tendency to collaborate or to work in groups seems stronger here than in the United States. We have a really sort of strong culture of the lone cowboy who solves everything in the United States. And so in some ways, I think that's a great cultural resource to build on, is the way that you all very naturally work and believe in working together in families and in a larger culture. So I think it's a resource on the improvement side for sure.
Gracias, muchísimas gracias, Alicia. Una espléndida exposición. Acá. No te vayas todavía. Bueno, y ahora para terminar, vamos a invitar al podio a un amigo de la casa, que ya no tenemos que darle la bienvenida, sino decirle, vuelves a tu casa. Es Hiro Koshikawa, que en este momento es profesor de la Universidad de Nueva York, lo era hasta hace poco de Harvard, y la verdad es que ha visto nacer esta criatura y ha ayudado a construirla desde el día 1, que es un buen comienzo. Además es asesor del secretario general de Naciones Unidas en Desarrollo Infantil Temprano y también integrante de la Comisión de Ciencias de la Educación del Departamento de Educación de Estados Unidos. Así que él nos va a presentar también una visión muy amplia y general del tema. Se llama Desafíos Globales para un Desarrollo Sustentable de Políticas de Primera Infancia. So, welcome, Hiro.
I would first like to thank our learning community of Un Buen Comienzo for again inviting me to speak to all of you. First and foremost, the Fundación CreandoOportunidad, which has been the main source of inspiration and funding for our work here in Chile, particularly Mariana Elwin, Marcela Marzolo, and the entire intervention team, the members of the board of the Fundación. We have engaged in a grand learning together for the past 7 years. The Universidad Diego Portales, Ernesto Treviño and his team at his center, who have been such wonderful partners in learning, both when I was at Harvard and now recently have just moved to New York University, but we still have our weekly meetings. The David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, the Ministry of Education here. This is our learning community. We do gather every few months. We do try to have our own metrics for change. And it has been very exciting to see this new phase of work of Un Buen Comienzo. Just to add a little bit of a note, in the United States, as Alicia mentioned, the enthusiasm for this model is now growing, and I am happy to share a membership on the National Board for Education Sciences with Tony Breik, who is the president of the Carnegie Foundation. And a side conversation at one of our meetings, I told him about our work in Chile, and it was the first time that he had heard of this approach being applied in education outside of the United States. So in South America and certainly in preschool education. And in part because of the emergence of this as a very promising model, the US Department of Education is now investing in research on continuous quality improvement of this type from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement for the first time in the United States. So we're hoping that this will be a national effort. Then the next thing I wanted to ask you to do again was to remind me which way is north. Can a few people point? Okay, that's north, right? Same as it was an hour ago. That's good. But I'd also like to say that if we were meeting in the countries of Rwanda or Cambodia or Estonia or the United States, and we were hearing Pedro's talk, we would have all pointed to the same spot. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is what a common north might mean in early childhood development for the world's nations. And start with a problem, which is that we do not have a stated common north from the United Nations that is a goal for comprehensive early childhood development. I think that's a problem. I hope you all agree that that's a problem. The global community of early childhood development practitioners, policymakers, and researchers agrees that this is a problem, that we don't have a common north in our current global development agenda. So this presentation will be presenting an attempt to define a common north, including specific wording for some indicators. And as you listen and read, I will be asking at the end for your input, which you can email after the meeting or raise during the questions, because we are still finalizing the report that will attempt to define what the common goal, target, and indicators will be, and very much using the same method that Pedro laid out that comes from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement as far as how specific we want to get on the definition. So I'm going to present first a little bit of background on the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is the network that I am part of representing the field of early childhood development. This is a network, I'll explain what its function is, but it is to propose feasible and scalable goals for sustainable development for the period of 2015 to 2030. And I'm going to talk specifically, provide a little bit of an introduction of the range of goals that the network is focusing on, which is quite large, but then focus on the goal which is relevant to education and learning. Talk about the costs of business as usual. What if we did not define a common north? What if we kept along with the current levels of investment and policies in early childhood development worldwide? What would be the cost of that? And then the proposed target and indicators for early childhood development. So the assumption of our current network, which is under the auspices of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and with a secretariat in New York at Columbia University, in Paris, and in New Delhi in India, is that the world is on an unsustainable course, and if we continue with business as usual on our current course, that we are on a path towards really the destruction of not only the earth but human civilization. So we have problems that are even more urgent than they were at the turn of the millennium in 2000, concerning issues of extreme poverty, conflict, fragile nations, big problems in education that I'll get into in a moment, still much too high levels of mortality in many countries of the world, and then a whole set of environmental climate crises, crises around renewable and non-renewable resources, and essentially we are bumping up against the limits of planetary resources. So one big problem is from the global perspective of defining a common north is that the current set of global development goals, the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, do not have any defined goal for comprehensive early childhood development beyond infant and maternal mortality. Infant and maternal mortality are extremely important goals in early childhood development. There has been an astonishing amount of progress since 2000 in reductions in infant mortality in Latin America, but also globally. But that means that for those children who survive, we do not have any common goal from the United Nations perspective for what children should be able to do, what their competencies should be, how they can be set on the right path for positive participation in society by age 5, by school entry, and by age 8. And the thesis of this report, this current report, is that beyond survival, children have a right to thrive. All children in the world, all children in Chile, all children, no matter what country they are born in. What we are trying to do with this report is also bring in what we think is a much stronger evidence base than we had 20 years ago. in the field of early childhood development. So I think many of you are familiar with the arguments. I'm not going to go into them. From neuroscience, from the biological sciences, from genetics, from economics, and from evaluation, that shows that early childhood is a period of extraordinary sensitivity to environmental influence. Whether that influence is bad in the sense of extreme adversity and risk, or positive in terms of enriching environments. In the Education for All goals, which were part of the last process of the global process for setting goals in education, there was an emphasis on education, which is very positive. Unfortunately, the focus was on what we call inputs, not outcomes, and so on expansion of access, but not about learning and what the actual outcomes are of education. So this network is divided into 12 groups. It's chaired by Professor Jeff Sachs at Columbia University, one of the leading experts in development economics. And each of the groups, roughly speaking, is devoted to one area of goals. Just to give a little bit of background, the Millennium Development Goals, there are 10 of them. Each of them has 3 targets, and each of the targets has a small set of indicators that have guided the work of UN agencies and of many countries in setting public policies for development between the period of 2000 and 2015. There has not been equal levels of progress across the goals. Infant mortality happens to be a very positive area, but many of the goals there has actually not been very much progress. So that is important to note. And so advocacy organizations, practitioners, political leaders, everybody has a role to play in moving governments and the civil society towards progress on these indicators. So this network, right now, we are engaged in defining what proposing goals and targets and indicators. Over the next year, there will also be a process of negotiation among the UN member countries to decide on the ultimate wording of the post-2015 goals. But we also have an interest in promoting solutions that will help the UN community and member nations achieve progress on these goals. So this is just to give you a sense of the range of the proposed goals that we have released in a first report in June 2013. This report, which is available on the SDSN website, provides proposed wording for 10 goals with input from hundreds and hundreds of organizations and individuals around the world, with a focus that will appear familiar from some of you who are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals. But the one we'll be talking about is goal number 3, which is to ensure effective learning for all children and youth for life and livelihood. So you notice, first of all, that the word education isn't even in the goal. We believe that learning happens in schools, but very importantly, learning happens in families and communities. And so if we shift from education to learning as a goal, we need to think about the role of families, of communities, of media, and all the different settings that children and youth live in. So, and the thematic group, I don't know why it has a different number than the goal itself, but our group considers learning from birth all the way to adulthood. So it is defined as a group encompassing early childhood development, education and learning, and the transition to work. So the draft, which was released for public comment, and it is still available for public comment, is called The Future of Our Children, Lifelong Multi-Generational Learning for sustainable development. And I'm putting the website up there because, again, we do welcome comment. And after a small trip to Easter Island, I will be working on some of the revisions to the report. So there are 3 targets to support the goal. And just to tell you a little bit about the reasoning behind the targets, they are meant to be measurable. And so exactly like the process of continuous quality improvement, without the definition of a measurable goal, we would have much less clarity. And so one criterion is that it is measurable, and ideally in the majority of the 190 UN member nations. The goal has to be relevant to high-income countries, not just low and middle-income countries. This is one way that the next set of goals will be different from the Millennium Development Goals, which were focused very correctly on extreme poverty reduction. But if we turn our attention to sustainable development, it is obvious that the rich countries bear an enormous amount of responsibility in shifting the world to a better course on sustainable development. Finally, the target and the indicators need to be easy to understand and brief. So before I get to the actual wording of the goal, the target, and the indicators, I wanted to present some data which tell us that if we continue with business as usual in early childhood development, we are truly on a very, very difficult course. The most sobering number right here is 200 million, which is the number of children worldwide who are at risk for not reaching their developmental potential by age 5. I'm sorry that this is very hard to read, but we define for this number of 200 million not reaching your developmental potential as being either stunted in growth by age 5 or experiencing absolute poverty. The current definition is under $1.50 US per day in household income. And we see that the regions vary in the degree to which we see this level of extreme risk. Latin America is among the regions that has made the most progress in the last 20 years, let's say since 1990. And Chile has been really right at the forefront, in part because of its advances in its healthcare system and its advances in its economic growth, which has certainly, together with poverty reduction policies, made enormous progress. What about issues of stunting? This is a very also sobering figure which shows that if we do not intervene in the first 1,000 days of life, patterns of stunting and growth faltering are very difficult. They are to reverse. They are nearly irreversible if a child is stunted by the age of 2 years. And this is data from 54 low and middle income countries. What are the consequences of stunting? We see in data across multiple countries that there are lower levels of learning brought about by this physical problem of stunting. Stunting is being 2 standard deviations below median growth, according to the World Health Organization. So we see the severe consequences of not providing supports to those 200 million children worldwide. The poorest children are at the greatest risk of being left alone or with inadequate care. Here, the dark bars represent the poorest 20% in each country. The blue lighter bars represent the richest 20%, and we see disparities in every country measured in this particular data set from around the world. We see, this is quite a disturbing slide, that physical forms of discipline are the primary form of discipline for young children ages 2 to 4 in most of the countries surveyed in the UNICEF Mix Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey dataset. So the dark bars here are represent the percentage of parents who use violent discipline, and the light blue bars are the percentage of parents who use only non-violent discipline. So here we need a tremendous effort to change the norms around issues of discipline and violence in the world. For pre-primary enrollment, this chart represents the enrollment data in 1990 and 2010 in terms of coverage, access to 1 year of pre-primary education. And we see that in much of the world, we have low levels of coverage, and unfortunately, most of the progress between 1990 and 2010 has been in the upper half, the global north we see. But what's interesting is Chile is certainly one of the countries that has made substantial progress. With higher levels of enrollment, we get closer to the red colors, and Mexico is another country that has made tremendous progress. And I would say Latin America is also a leading region in reducing gender inequality in access to primary education as well as pre-primary education. But we also know that in every region of the world, the most vulnerable families are enrolled in preschool at lower levels than the richest families. And that is true everywhere in South Asia. These numbers are a little bit different. They're driven by an extremely large public preschool program in the country of India that serves many of the most vulnerable children. What are the benefits of investment in ECD? These are quite astonishing figures. I think many of us are familiar with the benefit-cost ratio of some preschool programs in the United States, but the economists Jerry Behrman and Sergio Ursua have calculated what the benefits would be, the economic benefits of raising preschool enrollment in countries where it is currently lower than 50% to 50%, and calculate that the ratio is somewhere between $8 to $18 of benefit to society for every dollar invested in pre-primary education. Economists always put uncertainty into their models, and so there's a big difference between 8 and 18, but the 8 is the most conservative figure, and that's an enormous return to society. An extraordinary parenting program in Jamaica provided to children 0 to 2 was followed up 20 years later, and children and adults, there were multiple benefits. This is brand new data from Susan Walker, Paul Gertler, Jim Heckman, and colleagues. The participants showed higher IQ at age 22, reduced anxiety, depression, and violence, and 50% higher earnings. And so this is support in the form of home visits to parents, vulnerable parents with children at risk for stunting. So we know the extraordinary benefits of investment in ECD. And so we think that not having a common north here will result in huge losses of productivity, of participation, and of well-being. So our target is to ensure that all children under the age of 5 reach their developmental potential through access to quality early childhood development programs and policies. Every word of this has been reviewed by a large group of people, but we're still open to improvements in the wording. And we have emphasized that developmental potential is not a single construct. It encompasses physical, cognitive, social, and emotional domains of learning and development from birth to age 5. So, an earlier version of this goal was to reduce the 200 million children number by half to 100 million. But again, we needed a goal that was relevant to the rich countries, relevant to Norway, to the United States, to Chile, and not just the low-income countries. And so you'll notice that this is about universal access to quality early childhood development programs and policies. So now I'm going to take you through what our current set of 9 indicators, 9 measures that would, we hope, achieve this target. Again, we're looking for targets that are measurable, that are based on the research base, and so are evidence-based, that cover what we know about early childhood development, which is you cannot do education without health. You cannot do health without education. You cannot do either without attention to poverty reduction and social protection. We must pay attention to marginalized and disadvantaged groups, and this reflects a consensus among a range of global early childhood development stakeholders. In addition, we had to reduce the indicators to about 9, but in the report you'll see recommendations which get more to how do we implement, how do we achieve progress on these indicators. So you'll see the first 3 indicators are about health and nutrition, the proportion of children who suffer from preterm births or low birth weight. These are, we actually don't set numerical targets because that is nearly impossible to do worldwide. So every country might have a different target for any particular set of years, whether it's the next 2 years or 5 years or 15 years. And so these are indicators, but they don't set the actual levels of goals. The proportion of children who suffer from stunted growth by age 2, based on that evidence of the importance of the first 1,000 days. The proportion of households with access to comprehensive family planning, and for those children under 5, nutritional support and primary health care. Among families with children receiving health and nutritional interventions, the integration of parenting support that is focused on responsiveness and stimulation. This is one of the brightest findings in the 0 to 3 research literature of the last 15 years, which is if you integrate attention to parenting, to stimulation and interactions, children learn more. They're not only healthier, not only does it reduce the risk of stunting, but they do better in their early language development, in their early social and emotional development. We think this is a strong enough finding, proven in enough countries, that it must be integrated into 0 to 3 health and nutrition programs worldwide. Number 5 is about social protection policies, that we are encouraging children living in poverty in every country to have access to poverty reduction policies. Now, those policies might take different forms. Probably the most popular in low and middle income countries right now are conditional cash transfers, but family leave policies, parental leave policies are extremely important, and childcare provision and making childcare, quality childcare affordable is also a very important poverty reduction policy. The rate of developmental delays in children from birth to 8 years is unfortunately not tracked in far too many countries. It is not measured. We have many advocacy organizations and some policies, increasing policies to support this group, but we have a tremendous amount of work to do on that front. We think that the world in the long run should be moving towards universal pre-primary education. In the United States, President Obama was the first in February first president in US history to propose preschool for all 4-year-olds, and Chile has made some very rapid progress on that front, but we again emphasize quality, and in the report you'll see some of the same definitions of quality that we have been using in Un Buen Comienzo. The percentage of annual public spending on education that is devoted to pre-primary education, if you look at the available data, it isn't very complete, but it is often something like 2% or 3% of the public education budget. And if you think of the year, the extraordinary value of the 4-year-old year, 2% is by far too low. The proportion of children by age 8 who achieve basic competencies, we also believe, is extremely important. This gets to the transition to early public school and the fact that no matter how wonderful your preschool year is, those benefits are only sustainable if you pay attention to the quality of first grade, second grade, and third grade. So how do we actually implement these? And this, I think, brings us back to some of the themes from the other presentations today. The first step is national legislation and action planning. It is a core for thinking about national leadership. And in different countries, this occurs in different ways. But it is very important for civil society, NGOs, and the government to come together around advocacy to raise early childhood development to the top of national social development agendas. Integrating and coordinating across health, education, and social protection at the national level, at the regional level, and then at the local community level is a very difficult task. I've been conducting a study in collaboration with Pia Brito and Jan van Ravens and others on this. And what we often find is that the coordination breaks down at one or more of these levels. And so I think continuous quality improvement is a wonderful approach to try to ensure this integration through carefully coordinated teams that represent health and education, nutrition, and social protection. Governance structures with sustainability that are intersectoral are extremely important. Different countries do this in different ways across ministries, sometimes in the president or prime minister's office, sometimes integrating into local governance structures. Again, the sustainability is extremely important. Community participation in capacity building and professional development, and in the report we do cite sorry, I can't go back. Oh, yes, I can go back. We do cite the continuous quality improvement model as a powerful approach to engaging in this form of quality improvement. This also raises issues of measurement of children and of their environments and the quality of their environments. And we think a lot of the work over the next 10 to 15 years, and there are efforts underway all across Latin America in particular, and also other regions of the world, to start investigating new areas of children's development that the research is showing is extremely important. For example, executive function skills. We are starting to see multiple countries use some of the same measures in Latin America and think about what are the interventions that might build children's attention, their self-regulation, their cognitive flexibility. And we see that that's a very important part of Un Buen Comienzo, and we also see that emerging in other countries in Latin America. We also see the use of direct measures of quality, of centers, of homes, and of services. This is extremely important because in far too much of the world we have checklists that are not really based on close observation, that do not pay attention to the quality of interaction between children and the adults who care for them and teach them in early childhood. So we have some exciting efforts in different parts of the world and some global efforts, but there has to be much more work that is based in local cultural contexts, but then applicable in entire systems. What are some of the implications for OECD countries? One is that learning must incorporate socio-emotional development. Here again, I think Un Buen Comienzo has taken a lead to look at issues of creativity, what we are now referring to as 21st century skills that are not simply reading, math, and science, though those are core fundamental skills. The potential of early childhood development to contribute to the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. These are 3 dimensions that have been agreed upon at a meeting in Rio about a year ago, of economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. I think there's an enormous amount of work that we can do to try to make more powerful the potential of early childhood programs to, for example, increase the education, the learning, and the job skills of parents, to make a more powerful poverty reduction policy, to pay attention to the most socially excluded in particular countries, for example, children who do not have citizenship, children and families who do not have rights to basic education, health care, and social protection. Paying attention to education around the world and the environment, which I think is an important part of an area where we don't know enough about what works and why in preschool education, for example. And then finally, the professional development systems. Of course, I'm biased and think the role of mentoring and coaching, based on the experience of Un Buen Comienzo, but also in the United States, is extremely important. And unfortunately, in early childhood development systems, these providers are not getting this form of support. So the report, again, is here. I want to thank the many reviewers who reviewed it already, and I welcome your input and feedback on the report. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Hiro, con esta. Nos vamos con un mundo muy ancho sobre cuál es el tema que estamos tratando, y eso es maravilloso, aunque duro, ¿eh? Tu cuento es duro. It's hard, I mean. Bueno, no sé la hora qué, perdón. O sea, we are out of time. ¿Lo sé qué pasó con las preguntas? Acá, demasiado. Yeah. I will say in Spanish. And then, I'm sure there you have much more help than me, pero en fin. Much better help. En primera infancia, la responsabilidad depende básicamente de los adultos cercanos a los niños. ¿Qué focos existen a nivel mundial hacia la educación parental para apoyar el desarrollo, bienestar y aprendizaje de la primera infancia? Yes, is there any focus to help or educate parents to support their children?
There are 3 parental influences. Well, there are many more, but 3 that are particularly important and related to children's future developmental potential and success. The first is, I think, what the question was referring to, which is a parent's ability to encourage learning in their children. In the first year of life, that comes from the serve and return of responsive interactions. And so literally when an infant makes a cry or a gesture or affect, within how many seconds is there an adult who responds in a nurturing and appropriate way? As children's abilities expand, of course, other aspects of parenting become very important, such as language, the exposure to print materials, behavior management as kids start to behave unpredictably as they move around the world starting in the second year. And so the range of parenting behaviors becomes larger. So that's certainly the area of parenting is very important. And the second, though, is the area of parent mental health. And so we know, for example, that parental depression has large effects in reducing the ability to be responsive and to engage in language-rich interactions with children. And so in the report, we cite some exciting examples, such as a beautiful program in the country of Pakistan, where they are training community health workers, the nation's tens of thousands of health workers who go out and in fact are risking their lives in many communities to provide basic health, nutrition, breastfeeding information to low-income mothers. They have trained those health workers based on principles of cognitive behavioral therapy that have proven effective for depression, and put them into short training approaches so that they're engaging in those kinds of interactions with mothers who have experienced depression around the birth of their child, so postnatal depression. The experiment that evaluated that program found an astonishing reduction in maternal depression at the child age of 1 year, when the baby was 1 year. So in the intervention group, there were 58% of those mothers were experiencing diagnosed depression. And in the control group, 58% in the control group, but only 28% in the intervention or treatment group. So we have some very exciting attention now to issues of serious parent mental health. And then the final one, of course, is parents' economic conditions and their levels of poverty. And here, again, I think we need to understand that parents' abilities to help their children learn depend on the amount of stress that is in their lives that comes from deep and chronic poverty and the stresses associated with poverty. So we must consider social protection as part of encouraging parents' ability to help their children learn. And when parents are going back to classes, it may be basic education, it may be secondary education, it may be post-secondary education, as in Alicia's wonderful example. We know that when parents are engaging in those kinds of educational activities, their children do better. And that's because their expectations for their children's achievement improves, and their own sense of progress in their lives provides better psychological well-being for the parents. And so I think we have to pay attention to the fact that all adults in a community, whether parents, providers, caregivers, or teachers, need to provide a set of responsive interactions under situations where they feel capable of providing that support to children.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ino. Well, so this is the end. Gracias.
Además de agradecer a los expositores, quisiéramos agradecer a Sol por su participación en este seminario. Marcela Marzolo, directora ejecutiva de Fundación Educacional Oportunidad, también le va a entregar un reconocimiento. Antes de despedirnos, queremos invitarlo a responder una encuesta que encontrarán en la primera hoja de sus libretas. Estas encuestas serán requeridas por nuestras anfitrionas a la salida del salón. En nombre de Fundación Educacional Oportunidad, así como de los patrocinadores, esperamos que este seminario haya sido de su interés y que haya contribuido a los esfuerzos por mejorar la calidad de la educación inicial en nuestro país. Ahora los invitamos a disfrutar de un cóctel. Muchas gracias y muy buenas tardes.